Depth of field is a unique trait that is heavily affected by aperture, but there are a few other factors that control depth of field. And understanding these factors not only will give you a deeper understanding of your camera, but also have more control over the depth of an image. In the last lesson, we discussed how aperture affects depth of field. The larger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. The smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. There are three other factors that control depth of field. The length of a lens also affects depth of field. If I were to open up the aperture to f2.8, you might expect that the depth of field would become shallower because of what we learned in the previous lesson. Well, for the most part, this is true, but when filming on the wider side of, say, a 24 to 70mm lens, if I open the f-stop to f2.8, you will see that in this shot, much of the scene appears in focus. This is because the wider the lens is, the more depth of field we maintain. However, if I zoom in to 70mm, you'll notice that the shot becomes more compressed. The foreground and the background elements squeeze together, appearing closer to each other. The depth of field also becomes compressed. At longer lens lengths, a shallower depth of field is achieved. The focus distance also has an effect on depth of field. Focusing on a subject when it is close to the camera provides a shallower depth of field. Focusing on the same subject further away creates a larger depth of field. The camera's sensor size also affects depth of field. I'm simplifying this a bit, but I don't think the technical specs of a sensor is hugely important. All you really need to know is this. Typically, the smaller the camera sensor, the greater the depth of field. The bigger the sensor size, the shallower the depth of field. This is why so many filmmakers want a full-frame camera, because the larger sensor provides a shallower depth of field, which a lot of people consider cinematic. So if you're working with a camera that has a smaller sensor, but want a shallow depth of field, you can compensate for this by using the other two things that affect depth of field, which is increasing your lens length or bringing your subject closer to the camera. Depth of field has many variables, and understanding how each of these factors affects depth of field will allow you to maintain control of different filming situations with a variety of gear. To recap, the longer the lens, the smaller the depth of field. The wider the lens, the larger the depth of field. The closer the focus distance, the smaller the depth of field. The further the focus distance, the larger the depth of field. A large camera sensor size gives a smaller depth of field, while a smaller sensor size gives a larger depth of field. In the next lesson, we will discuss the many practical uses of aperture and depth of field.